week I presented the charts on the left from these are from Jared Minak. He did a couple of reports. He's an excellent independent economist. He used to be the chief economist at Morgan Stanley, then went out on his own. And he basically showed that population growth is one of the main drivers of house prices, and that's the chart on the left globally. So he's not saying it's the main driver, but it's the main driver that accounts for the difference in Australia's stronger house price growth versus other countries. It's obviously interest rates and all that, and borrowing capacity, which is more of a global thing because we've all had similar increases in borrowing capacity with the Basel II capital rules, etc., which are global banking rules, which basically fueled house prices everywhere to a degree. But one of the factors why Australia has experienced much stronger house price growth is because it had high population growth. Obviously, the chart in the middle, it's the dominant driver of rental growth, right? So we've had this record migration post-pandemic. At the same time, we haven't been able to build enough homes or anything. And we've had this massive rise in advertised rents. So according to Cotality, 47% rise in advertised rents since the end of 2019. So far this century, added about $11,500 to the annual cost of renting a typical home versus what it was in December 2019. So massive hit. Now this week, that's kind of the intro point. This week we got migration data from the ABS. So they released two bits of migration related data. Now early in the week we got net permanent long-term arrivals. Now what that is, that's basically when people come in that are passenger cards, and they self-declare why they're coming to Australia. So you can be coming as a returning citizen, or you're coming as a permanent or long-term arrival. And what that means is if you intend to stay in Australia for 12 months or more. So it's your intention, not whether you actually end up doing it. But irrespective, that net permanent long-term arrivals figure was the highest figure for a January in Australia's history. So for the month of January is the highest in Australia's history. The annual figure, which is presented in that chart in the top left in the red, it's basically back up to its highest level in history. So we had 494,000 net permanent long-term arrivals in the year to January, which is just extraordinary. Now on yesterday, which is we're recording this on Friday, so on Thursday we got the official quarterly net overseas migration data from the ABS for the September quarter of last year. And what that showed is that net overseas migration has actually reaccelerated. So it looked like at the end of last year it was starting to fall, albeit at unbelievably high levels historically, but actually rebounded. It went from about 304,000 in the second quarter of last year up to 311,000. So that's firmed as well. You can see there in that chart, it historically tracks the net permanent long-term arrivals data, but for some strange reason, which is a mystery to me, it is decoupled over the last year or two. But irrespective, net overseas migration 311,000 is the second highest. If we looked at just the period pre-pandemic in Australia's history, so before 2020, that would have been the second highest level in Australia's history, right? The highest was in like June 2008, I think it was. We got 315,000. So it is still extremely high, like historically high. And you can see in the middle chart there, I've got net overseas migration per day in office. So that's for all the former 5 governments and all the way back to the 1980s. In the first 3 and 1/4 years of the Albanese government, so three years and 1/4, we've had 1,145 net overseas migrants land in Australia every single day of their term in office. That is insane. It's almost double the level under the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government. And I've excluded the pandemic closure there. So that's Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison is from the end of 2013 up to the end of 2019. So you leave out the pandemic closures because that distorts it. It's almost double the Rudd-Gillard years, which was considered big Australia. It dwarfs Howard. It's nearly triple the Howard government's annual daily arrival rate. And it's, what's that, like 5 times plus the Hawke-Keating net overseas migration. So we are running migration super hot in Australia, and it's actually rebounding again. And, often I get pro-migration shills like Abel Rizvi, and they always attack me and call me a racist and that sort of thing. He always goes, "Oh, you shouldn't quote net permanent long-term arrivals. It's not the measure that matters. It's net overseas migration." Well, actually, net permanent long-term arrivals is probably more economically significant to the housing market than net overseas migration. So the difference between the two, as I said, net permanent long-term arrivals is people arriving and stating their intentions, right? Net overseas migration is what happens to those intentions, and they have a very restrictive definition. So you're only a net overseas migrant if you stay in Australia for 12 out of 16 months in a 16-month period. So if you stay for 11 months in that 16-month period, you're not counted as a net overseas migrant. But I'd argue for the housing market, it's the people in the country that matter, right? And I'm not including tourists who stay in hotels and stuff, but it's the total number of people in Australia that matter. So if you come here and you stay for 10 months, you're still putting pressure on the housing market, but you won't be counted as a net overseas migrant. Now, the bottom chart there, the one in the dark color chart, that comes from Tarek Brooker, right? Who writes for MB and he runs his own shop and Substack called Avid Commentator. He's an absolute gun. And he's actually plotted this. He put this up on Twitter or X on Thursday. He plotted the growth in Australian advertised rents. I'm presuming you use Cotality versus the growth in net permanent long-term arrivals. And you can see there's a pretty damn strong correlation, right? So we've had this rebound in rental growth, and that's shown on the top right-hand side, bottom right-hand corner, Australian advertised rents. It's rebounded. And you can compare that to the red line on the top left chart of net permanent long-term arrivals. It's a bit suspicious, isn't it? Net permanent long-term arrivals has rebounded. Advertised rents has rebounded. That sort of suggests that actually has a bigger impact on the rental market than if you're officially a net overseas migrant, which is measured later by the ABS, right? And it's based on that restrictive 12, 16-month rule. But irrespective, I've shown the top right-hand corner from Cotality, the rental vacancy rate, according to them, is tracking its lowest level in recorded history, right? It's fallen to a new record low. We've had a 47% increase in advertised rents since the end of 2019. Advertised rents are now re-accelerating, as the bottom right chart shows. They're now tracking at like 5.5%, which is higher than wage growth, obviously. So the rental crisis is just getting worse. And it's getting worse because our idiot government keeps the immigration spigots, nearly on full blast. Right, where they're still running incredibly high net overseas migration. They're keeping the borders wide open, and this is pressuring the rental market. Of course it is. And in fact, just today, or last night, I should say, Treasurer Jim Chalmers did a speech in Melbourne to like an economic society or whatever, where he basically said that the federal budget is going to upgrade the migration forecasts because it's running stronger than they thought. So they thought that net overseas migration this financial year would fall to about, I think it was 260,000 by memory. It's tracking in the first quarter of this financial year, which is the September quarter we have data for, it's tracking at 311,000. They expect it to, I read in the press, they expect it to be around 300,000. So it's obviously running well ahead of the budget. And remember, I said previously that National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, their latest State of the Housing System report, which was released last year, forecasted we'd have 79,000 shortage of homes over the 5-year period. That was based on the Centre for Population Forecasts, and which is the Treasury. And they said that if population growth grows 15% faster than Treasury assumes, instead of having a 79,000 shortage over 5 years, that's on top of the shortage you already have, we'd have 200,000. Well, it looks like Treasurer Chalmers has just admitted that migration is going to run significantly faster than what the Treasury forecast, which ergo means the rental crisis is going to get worse. Now, the reason why this annoys me so much is because A, it's never talked about, right? Like, the mainstream media, the government always paints this as a supply problem. They always whinge about the housing crisis. Oh, housing shortage, terrible. We're still got to build more homes. No, I mean, yeah, that's great to do that, but it'll take years to do if you even can do it. The solution is to cut immigration because you're running it way too hot and you've just re-accelerated again through, like, why are we doing this? It's just stupid. And there's, as I've said in the last few podcasts, there is a complete counterfactual in Canada. And in fact, we got migration data from Canada this week, right? So previously, I think I talked about last week or the week before, we had migration data for the September quarter in Canada. Well, guess what? We now got the December quarter in Canada, literally was released this week. And that's the chart here in the middle. And what it showed is that Canada had recorded its first ever population decline, well, first since the Second World War. Well, I think the data goes back to the 1960s. The first recorded population decline on record. And Canada actually had, because Canada has basically put restrictions, they've cut the permanent migrant intake, and they're basically trying to reduce the number of temporary migrants in the country. So I think it was 2004 at the peak, they had 7.6% of Canada's population were temporary migrants, or they call them non-permanent residents over there. Now they're trying to manage that down. It's fallen to, I think the latest reading is about 6.4%. So they're actually booting out temporary migrants. They're trying to shrink the number. And as a result, the population's falling in Canada. Well, as I said last week, the chart on the top left shows that chart's taken from 2004, early 2004, when Canada's rental crisis was at its worst, like Australia, where they just had a record immigration boom. Rents were growing at their fastest level in history. They had record low rental vacancy rates. The difference is the Canadian government in mid-2004 slashed immigration, and now they've had their first ever population decline, or the first decline in 60-odd years of records, and their rental crisis is being solved. And that's all the charts on the right. And I've already been through these previously, but Canada has recorded 17 consecutive months of falling rents, right? Which accords to the cut in immigration. Their rents are down, I think, $172 per month versus what they were at the peak. So tenants are saving, what's that, over $2,000 a month in their rents now because rents have fallen. Their rents are tracking at a 33-month low, right? So great news if you're a renter, you're paying less, you've got rental affordability now. All the government's done is cut immigration, and the percentage of income required to service the median rental in Canada has fallen below their 30% affordability threshold. That's the chart, the bottom right chart. So it was tracking at 34% of income to rent the median home in Canada 2 years ago. Well, now it's 29%. And you can see it's the best in probably 10 years. Unfortunately, the chart doesn't go back that far. But, this is just proves without a shadow of a doubt that if you run an immigration program that's too high and is beyond the nation's capacity to build housing infrastructure, you end up with record low rental vacancy rates, soaring rents, and a rental crisis, right? And that's exactly what Australia's experienced since the start of the pandemic, right? We've got a 47% increase, according to Cotality, in advertised rents. The typical renter now is paying $11,500 more to rent the median home than they were in December 2019. Wages have gone up at 1/3 the rate of rents. So rents have risen 3 times faster than wages, right? So they're getting absolutely crushed here by high immigration, and immigration's accelerated again. So the government has just literally spat on renters by running this absurdly high immigration program. Yet over in Canada, which has a left-leaning government as well, like their Liberal government is the equivalent of the Labor government, whereas their coalition is the Conservatives over in Canada. So their Albanese equivalent, the Liberal Party in Canada, saw the error of their ways and has deliberately cut immigration, and it solved the rental crisis. But our idiotic government is running a high immigration program, and Spin Jin Chalmers has just come out and said, oh, it's going to be higher than we budgeted for by, great. So that's not, so you've missed the target again. And to add insult to injury, he's also said that previously Treasury had forecast that Australia's productivity growth would return to its long-run trend, which is poor anyway, in 2 years. Now he's saying it's going to return in 5 years. So our productivity growth sucks as well. It's going to be worse than what they forecast. And one of the reasons why he said our productivity growth sucks in his speech is because we've had declining capital deepening. And capital deepening, one of the reasons for the declining capital deepening is high immigration. So capital deepening has basically been one of the main drivers of Australia's productivity growth since the Second World War, and not just Australia, but advanced economies. And I've said this previously, capital deepening happens when you supply your workers with more or better capital and technology, etc. So more tools to work with, more machines, whatever. It makes them more productive, right? But we've actually had a decline in capital deepening. And in fact, we've had capital shallowing, whereby it's measured by a thing called the capital to labor ratio. So capital is all your machinery, tools, that sort of thing. And then the labor is just the number of workers. And the numerator, we've had very poor business investment for about 20 years. So that's the numerator of that ratio. But we've also run the highest immigration in the nation's history, which is the denominator. So if you have a falling numerator and a rising denominator, your capital rate labor ratio crashes. So here we are. Treasurer Chalmers does his speech saying, oh, sorry, guys, immigration's higher than we thought. Productivity is going to be lower than we thought. One of the reasons why we've got poor productivity is because we've had less capital deepening, which is capital shallowing. Well, one of the reasons why I've got less capital deeping in is because we've run higher than budgeted, higher than expected immigration, which has increased the denominator of the capital to labor ratio. If you don't grow your capital stock as fast as you grow your population, you get capital shallow and you get lower productivity growth. So this country of ours, our leaders are just morons, and they're creating a rental crisis. They're killing our productivity growth. They're destroying us through poor energy policy. It is just infuriating.